This is a lecture about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a way, that's what this whole course is about. Your freedom to live for yourself and achieve your values. This lecture, however, is dedicated to individual rights, the principles that enable human beings to live freely and happily in a society. The previous lecture's subject was ethics. In that lecture, and indeed in all three lectures earlier today, I spoke about what an individual needs to do and to be in order to survive, to flourish, and to be happy. In moving to politics, we switch to talking about what a society ought to be. Moral philosophy exists to guide an individual. Political philosophy exists to guide a political community. But this is still objectivism. And every aspect of objectivism has a common purpose: to enable you to live your own life in reality, to survive, to flourish, to be happy. Even the objectivist politics has that purpose. Always and in everything, objectivism holds that your life belongs to you and that the good is to live it. This is the principle that sets you free to pursue your values and achieve your happiness. This means that if government is justified at all, it must be justified by what it does for you, the individual. You are the valuer who must decide whether government is worth having. Your life supplies the standard and purpose of value, which government must contribute to if you're going to value it. And not just government, but society itself must be justified to you. If it is a good idea for you to live in society, it can only be because you are better off living among human beings than alone. You do not have to justify your existence or your pursuit of your own happiness to anyone. At most, you need to justify your relationships to the people you choose to have relationships with, because their lives belong to them, just as yours belongs to you. The objectivist approach to politics can thus be summarized by twisting a familiar quotation. Ask not what you can do for your country till you know what your country does for you. As with all values, it takes action to gain and to keep a good society. And when we see what a free society does for its members, we'll see that it's worth an effort to gain and keep one. The Founding Fathers were right to fight to create this country. Immigrants, such as Ayn Rand, were right to come here. And, as I'll explore in more depth on Saturday, it is worth it for them and for everyone who chooses this country to fight for its freedom. And for those who choose other countries, or can't escape them, there is real value to be sought, even at great cost, in achieving and protecting your country's freedom. But we can't know that just by looking at the social or national level. Only an individual is an ultimate value. Only you are the goal of your life. And if your country is to be worth anything, it must be because of what your country does for you. So, what makes it worth living in society? Society is a bunch of people, most of whom you don't know. Here's a bunch of random Americans gathered in Times Square to celebrate the Allies' victory over Japan and the end of World War II. You don't know these people. Some of them may be robbers, pickpockets, murderers. And they all have free will. They could decide to turn criminal at any time. Why would you want to live with these people? Why not hide yourself in a cabin in the woods? Shoot anyone who comes near. Is it just because you can't think of a wilderness where you could hide yourself? Or is there some real value to be found in living in a society with other human beings? Well, for one thing, some of these people may know things you don't know. Actually, every one of these people knows some things you don't know, but some of them may know some things that you don't know and would benefit from learning, and that they'd be willing to teach you. I said, why not hide in the woods and shoot anyone who approached? But how would you even know how to live in the woods without others to help you learn? You'd have to figure out everything from scratch. There's a lot of knowledge involved in living in the woods. Figuring all that out would take time, perhaps more time than you'd have before you needed it. Many of these people have skills you don't have. If you want to hide in the woods with a gun, where did you get the gun? Most likely, if you want a gun, you need to buy it. That means other people will have made the gun. Lots of other people, actually. No one knows how to build a gun from scratch. That would mean finding ores, mining them, creating the right alloys, molding them into parts, assembling the parts, etc., plus all the logistical tasks involved, plus running the companies that do all these things. So how do you end up with a gun? All by yourself in the woods, you don't end up with a gun. But in a society, if you want a gun and the government doesn't get in the way, you do end up with a gun. You get it because you create some other value, and someone pays you money for that, and you buy a gun. And when you buy that gun, you pay, indirectly, for the tiny portion you need of the work of all the people whose efforts and specialized skills went into creating the gun. You pay for the miner, who probably doesn't know how to run a company, and the shipping executive, who probably wouldn't have a clue what to do with mining equipment, and so on. And because you're getting your gun, your food, your entertainment, and all sorts of other goods and services, by trade for the few specific services that you provide, you can spend your time on making those services as valuable as you can in order to use them to buy all the other things that you want. Of course, for that to work, you don't just need a bunch of people with skills you don't have doing work you can't do. You also need a bunch of people who don't have skills that you do have, but who have money earned with their skills, with which they are willing and able to pay for what you produce. Note that it isn't just important that they aren't doing what you're doing. They need to be producing value too, so that they have something to trade for what you produce. More generally, society is full of other people with whom you might establish relationships. All kinds of relationships. You might work for someone or hire him, buy from him, sell to him. You might find friends. You might even fall in love. Whatever kinds of relationships you want in your life, you need people to form those relationships with. And the more people there are around you, the more people there are who might turn out to be the people you want to know. And yet, as I mentioned, people are also potential threats. That is to say, they might choose to interfere with your life. They might stop you from living, or from living the way you want to, or from keeping and using the goods you've produced. In short, there's a lot of potential value in living in society, but there's also a lot of potential danger. The great task of political philosophy is to specify the terms of social coexistence under which people can live fully human lives in society. If you're going to have a fully human life in society, what you fundamentally need to do is live. And since a human being lives by thinking for himself and acting on his judgment, you need to be able to do that in society, to live by your own independent judgment. As I discussed in the last lecture, independence doesn't exclude considering what others have to say. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, being able to take into account what others say is one of the great advantages of living in society. And as I mentioned earlier in the course, human beings live by creating the values that sustain our lives, notably including material values, or in other words, stuff. So in society, we need to create values, we need to keep them, we need to use them. And of course, one of the great advantages of society is the opportunity for trade. And we need to be able to do all this for the purpose of our own lives, in order to survive, flourish, and be happy. Beyond this, we need to see the world as open to our action, just as we need to see the physical world as a place where we can act effectively. If we're going to live in society, we need to see the social world as a place where we can act effectively. That means we need to be able to understand it and to predict the results of our actions. And it means we need to see society not as a dungeon with threats around every corner, where we must live in a constant state of fear, but as a safe place, where we can expect benefits and opportunities instead of harms. Since we need to do all these things, we need other people, all those other people we're in society with, to refrain from interfering with our doing these things. For example, when we create things, we need other people not to take them away. And because we recognize the value we gain from having neighbors who are doing well, we want others to do all these same things that we need to be able to do, to live by independent judgment, and so forth. The list on my left, or on the left of the slide, may look a bit familiar, especially if you recognize the document on the right, the United States Declaration of Independence. The principles of rights are the principles we need society to recognize in order for us to live and flourish in it. And the four major rights that Rand mentions correspond to the four items with the blue dots. The fundamental right is the right to life, the right to engage in the process by which a human being sustains himself. At one level, that means your biological processes. But it also means all the activities that go into a fully human life. And that's why the other rights follow from it. Since man lives by acting on his independent judgment, you have a right to liberty, to the freedom to think and to act on the basis of what you think. Since man lives by creating values and then using them, or trading them for other values and using those, you have a right to property. And since your goal in living is to live a long, full, and happy life, you have the right to pursue your own happiness. I want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about two of these rights. First, the right to property. The right of property is based on the idea that human beings create value, and that in order to live, we need to create value and then use it. And as I said, we need to do that in society as well, without other people interfering. So we have a right of property, which is a right to keep control, and dispose of what we create. The right of property makes the virtue of productiveness effective in society. And, of course, it makes it possible to trade the products of one's work. That means it both protects our ability to do what we would need to do even outside society, to create values and use them, and it also makes possible some of the greatest advantages of society. To a large extent, the division of labor is possible only because of property rights. And without property, you could have very little effective liberty. For example, you can't live the way you want in your own home if you don't have the control over it that a property right gives you. You couldn't, for example, invite the people you want and exclude the people you don't want. In fact, when anything is not private property, it is difficult or impossible to find a principled way of resolving disputes over it. For example, most streets are not private property. And that means there are all sorts of arguments about who can use them for what. Are people entitled to have protest marches? Are they entitled to park food trucks wherever they want? Are bicyclists entitled to use traffic lanes? A private owner would be entitled to decide such questions however he wished, and would presumably do so in the most profitable way. But the government seems to be impeding liberty whenever it says no to any of these uses. And yet these uses may interfere with other people's use of the streets. A march may require closing the street to traffic. The crowds at food trucks may get in the way of pedestrian traffic. Cyclists often can't go as fast as drivers would, and if they're in the traffic lanes, they reduce the drivers with their powerful cars to bicycle speed. Because the streets are publicly owned, all these issues end up being addressed politically, and no one has a solid claim of right. Like the Declaration of Independence, Rand and other objectivists talk about the right to the pursuit of happiness. But this seems a bit different from the others. Liberty and property seem to name distinct realms of action. We can, at least in many cases, spot a liberty violation without thinking about property, or a property violation without thinking about liberty. For example, if the government prohibits you from drinking alcohol for non-medical purposes, that's a violation of liberty. And if it takes your house, that's a violation of property. But any violation of the right to pursue happiness is also a violation of liberty or property. But in fact, rights principles always interact. My liberty to drink alcohol, for example, can't be exercised unless I first come to own alcohol. And ultimately, all rights are aspects of the right to life, or, as I prefer to say, the right to live, because what rights protect is the activity of living. And what the right to pursue happiness emphasizes is your right to live for your own sake. It calls our attention to the fact that liberty isn't just a right to decide how to serve others, and that property rights aren't just a scheme for managing quote-unquote society's assets. No. These are rights to go about living your life in the pursuit of your own happiness. So, for example, when I looked at antitrust law, while there were certainly violations of liberty and property rights there, what I found most significant was that antitrust sees businessmen's freedom as something government gives them in order to maximize consumer welfare. And that means that antitrust completely rejects the principle of the right to the pursuit of happiness. If you want to follow up on my analysis of antitrust law, there's a lecture from last year's summit that's available on our website, as well as some written items. Every right is a right to do something, to live, to choose your actions, to gain and keep values, to pursue your own happiness. But every right is also a protection against something. It prohibits other people from interfering with the things that you have a right to do. Specifically, rights prohibit the initiation of force. They prohibit fraud. Force and fraud both prevent you, or at least impede you, from using your judgment to pursue your values, which, of course, is how a human being lives. Sometimes, force comes in the form of direct force. If I break your arm, that gets in the way of a wide variety of actions, including the basic functioning of your body. If I put you in chains, that prevents you from taking any number of actions to advance your life and achieve your values. And if I take your property, I'm taking away a value you've already achieved and preventing you from using it as the basis of a future action. If I threaten you, you do have a choice, in a way. For example, if I threaten to kill you unless you give me money, you could give me the money, or you could try to escape, or you could defy me and perhaps try to kill me first. But these are all ways to avoid or minimize harm, and not, or not primarily, to gain additional values. Rand held that fraud and violation of contract are also forms of force because they involve taking property from its owner without consent. Refraining from force is the only thing your rights require from me. And that's why they're called negative rights. They tell me certain things I must not do. But they don't require me to do anything affirmatively. All I have to do is stay out of your way. But why should I refrain? The argument I've just made is all about why you need me to refrain from violating your rights, and I need you to refrain from violating mine. But objectivism holds that you live for your sake and I live for mine. So if you have reason to respect my rights, and I have reason to respect your rights, that reason still has to be identified. It can't just be that each of us needs our own rights respected, because it simply isn't the case that respecting other people's rights makes sure that they respect yours. You can't control whether other people respect your rights just by whether you choose to respect theirs. So, what are some reasons to respect rights? Well, one is that respecting rights is a matter of justice, of treating people as rational human beings who need to think and act. And in the case of property rights, as treating people as the individuals who created the values they own. If I want people to try to benefit me, the best reason I can give them is that I'm offering them value for value. If I'm harming them or threatening to harm them, what they need to do is minimize the cost of avoiding that harm, not maximize the help they give me. Trade is based on the principle that every person needs to think for himself and pursue his own interests. And this is exactly the principle behind rights. That said, in cases where I'm not seeking value from my potential victim, cases where all I want is for him not to be there anymore, the argument for trade doesn't apply, at least not directly. There may be emergencies that raise special issues as well. The virtue of productiveness also weighs against violating people's rights in order to gain something from them. If I gain the values I need by trade, then I am creating the values I need to live. That is, what I receive in trade is the result of the value I created. I'm supporting myself by creating the equivalent in value to what I consume, at least as judged by those I'm trading with in the context of their own lives. Pride, as we discussed earlier, is the virtue of working on one's own good character. And that's relevant here as well. If I want to find opportunities for trade rather than opportunities for plunder, then I need to be on the lookout for opportunities for trade rather than opportunities for plunder. I need to approach people with mutual benefit in mind. Notice that this isn't just a reason to trade sometimes. It's a reason to stick to trade as my way of obtaining values, rather than going with trade or force as the occasion arises. Violating people's rights harms them, and I gain from dealing with people who are doing well. That's another reason not to violate their rights. The people who are most worth dealing with are smart, focused, productive people. But those are also the people it's hardest to deceive. For that matter, the hardest to rob. If I want to be a fraud or a robber, I'll have to seek out people who have less to offer. And however I act, I can expect to develop a reputation to match. And that will influence who is willing to engage in what kinds of relationships with me. If I am known as a rights violator, that'll make it harder for me to find future partners or victims. But if I'm known as a source of value, that'll make it easier for me to find trading partners. Plus, I'll get the satisfaction that comes from knowing that other people value interacting with me. Yet, even with all those reasons that a virtuous person would normally respect rights, there are still two ways in which rights fall short of their goal if we treat them simply as ethical principles. First, in some cases, the arguments are futile. You need to be able to rely on your rights, yet some people can't be convinced, or can't be convinced in time. There's no time to argue when you're being robbed. No opportunity to argue when your house is being burgled in your absence. And even when there is time to argue, a very large percentage of the population remains so unconvinced by the arguments for rights that even half a century after Atlas Shrugged was published, they keep voting for politicians who don't agree with the principles of rights. So even if a large majority does become convinced, we can expect that some people won't be. And sometimes, even a rational man may conclude that the right thing to do is to violate rights. Suppose, for example, that you're being chased through the woods by a bear. You come across a sign, you come across a cabin with a big sign that says, "Keep out." Do you respect property rights, or do you save your life? You save your life, of course, even if that means you have to compensate the owner later. You can't flourish tomorrow by dying today. And the same thing applies in the case of imminent starvation. You can't flourish tomorrow by dying of starvation today. Because sometimes people will want to violate your rights, you need your rights to be enforced. You need someone to stop people from violating your rights. Or if you can't completely stop people from violating your rights, you may at least need people to be deterred or forced to pay compensation. All this requires retaliatory force. That is, it means you need someone to use force against the people who violate your rights. Who that someone is, we'll get to shortly. But for now, let's just say someone. Maybe even you. The second problem is that you need everyone, or nearly everyone, to agree on what your rights are, or at least to act as if they agree. This isn't the case with the virtues. It doesn't harm you if other people aren't productive. If they have nothing to offer you, you don't trade with them. But you can just walk on by. With rights, that won't do. You can't just walk on by somebody who's trying to rob you. Consider what happens if people act on contradictory principles of rights. Take the case of patents. Rand thought that patents were a form of property right. Many libertarians think that patents are a rights violation. I don't want to get into which position is true. That's too specific a topic for an introductory lecture on the theory of rights. Dale Halling will defend the case for patents tomorrow. What I want to address is the consequences of disagreement if some people act on each view. Imagine first a society in which patents are generally respected and enforced. In such a society, an inventor has a monopoly on selling his invention. That means that even if he's not in a position to mass produce it, he can sell the rights to someone who is. But there's a drawback. When he's working on his invention, he has to be careful not to infringe anyone else's patent. Otherwise, that patent will be enforced against him, and he may not be able to profit on his invention at all. On the other hand, imagine a society in which patents don't exist. In that society, a freelance inventor who creates something it takes a lot of money to mass produce has much less to offer a manufacturing concern. He might give a business that's willing to pay him first crack at the market, but as soon as the product becomes popular, assuming it can be reverse engineered, others will start manufacturing it. The flip side of this system is that while he's working on his invention, he can make free use of all existing art. He's not limited by other people's patents. So if he's good at making small improvements to existing technologies, he may be able to get a job where he looks at new products that have come out, makes slight improvements, and enables his employer to produce copies that are better than the original. But a society where some people believe in patents and others don't, and both sides try to enforce their view, will give him to a large extent the worst of both worlds. If he invents something, it's liable to be copied. Yet if he improves on something, he risks having the patent enforced against him. Much the same is true with particular property claims, even where there is agreement that the object concerned actually is property. For example, if each of us thinks that he or she owns this computer, we have a problem. In fact, if each of us thinks that we own this computer and the other one owns that computer, then we have a problem. If you think that's bad with computers, imagine it with houses. Houses. Imagine if each of us thought we owned this house and the other person owned that house. If we each tried to enforce our opinion against the other person, we'd quickly find that our property claims aren't doing us the good we need rights to do. We're not able to control the values that we produced or traded for. And similarly, even if everyone agrees that a certain sort of action would be a rights violation, if there's a dispute over whether someone did that action or not, some people might try to punish him and others to protect him. Likewise, if there's a dispute over whether a proposed punishment is excessive, some people might try to impose it and others to prevent them from doing so. The function of government is to secure individual rights. Again, the words of the Declaration of Independence. Government does not create rights. Rights are principles, and indeed rights are the reason to have government in the first place. But neither are rights entirely independent of government. It takes government to make them work. The most obvious aspect of securing our rights is enforcing them. That means government upholds rights not only by talking about them, which any philosopher can do, but by putting physical force behind its statements. Government arrests people, keeps them locked up, forces them to turn over their property, sometimes it even kills them. When government does its job properly, it does these things only for the purpose of upholding rights. That means if someone is inclined to violate rights, he doesn't just face arguments, he faces the power of the government. And in order to make sure that government's enforcement of our rights is effective, we need to make sure that that power is overwhelming. But as I argued, rights are also not effective if they're not clear. And while the correct answers about rights, like all other philosophical matters, have to be found by philosophy, philosophical agreement is hard to come by. And since people need a working account of rights that we have in common, that working account has to be supplied by government. That is, by the law that government specifies. Indeed, as to some matters, philosophy may only get us so far. There may be a range of equally good answers that a government can choose. The more clearly government specifies the law, the more an individual can know what the legal effects of his actions will be, what he'll own, what debts or damages he may owe, what punishment he may incur. And not only that, but the more effectively the government enforces that law, the more an individual will be able to rely on his rights. The more secure he'll be, the better able he'll be to take the actions he needs to live and flourish in society. Just as government has to make rights more specific in principle, it has to apply them to individual cases. It has to decide lawsuits and determine the guilt or innocence of accused criminals. You might well ask, why should government get to make these decisions? The answer is that if government is going to enforce rights, government has to decide where, when, and how to do that. You can't just say, I'm going to enforce the correct principles of rights. You have to determine what you think those are. You can't just say, I'm going to punish the guilty defendants. You have to determine who those are. And you have to act on your judgment. Even if some cases are adjudicated by private arbitrators, if those arbitrators' decisions are going to be enforced by the government has to determine at least when a properly binding arbitration has been made, because it's the government that's doing the enforcing. The point of all this is to subordinate force to reason. That is, to make sure that what's enforced is not just someone's preference, but an objective, reliable interpretation and application of the principles of rights that human beings need to live by if they're going to survive, flourish, and be happy in a society. In other words, the function of government is to establish the rule of objective law. For government to fulfill this function, it must act by and according to objective law, and only by and according to objective law. There are three kinds of objectivity that you need government to apply in order to create a social environment suitable for humans to flourish. First, individuals need laws that are objective in their justification. That is, laws that actually serve human needs. As we've seen, that means laws that implement the principles of individual rights. Second, you need the law to be objective in its terms. That is, one should be able to tell, as clearly as possible, what the law provides. There should not be a lot of borderline cases. And third, you need the government to apply the law objectively. That is, if you're going to rely on the law to mean in practice what it means in theory, you need officials who will apply it according to what it says. not according to their personal preferences or their feelings or any factors that are not relevant by the terms of the law. When government goes beyond its function, government itself is the greatest threat to the people under its rule. When the government goes against its purpose, because of the extent of its power and the scale of its actions, it can do more damage than the private criminals or private mistake makers that we need it to protect us from. It does damage when people comply with unjust laws and thereby miss out on opportunities that they should have had. For example, if I want to start a business but I can't get the license that the law requires, and out of respect for the law or fear of the government, I don't start the business illegally, well, then I've been harmed by the law, even though, or because, I'm complying. And, of course, the government does damage in response to non-compliance when it punishes people for violating unjust laws. And government does even more damage when it simply acts arbitrarily or by mistake. And when government interferes in your life, the extent of the damage is often quite severe. Government ruins lives. Precisely because we need government to be able to crush crime, government is so strong that it is very difficult, effectively impossible, to resist it, except to the extent it provides legal means of doing so. So that's why it's very important to find ways to control government and keep it to its purpose. And that's why we need a principle of due process to make sure that there are legal means of responding when the government gets something wrong. Now, I talked about why we need government to protect our rights. But why do we need government to protect other people's rights? Well, the first thing is we need our own protection to be reliable. If the government is simply inadequate to protect the other guy's rights, it's inadequate to protect ours too. If the government is biased in our favor, we can't rely on things remaining that way. For example, if you happen to have political connections and the government is biased in your favor and is protecting your rights and not the other guy's for that reason, well, the other side may win someday. Moreover, an oppressive regime nurtures resentment. Even if the constitution of the present regime doesn't provide for the other side to win, for the people it's biased against to win, they may win anyway. And an oppressive regime nurtures resentment, as I say, which means that what happens next may put you in a much worse position than merely equal. And remember, we value society for a reason. Every reason you need your rights respected, the next person does too. And the benefits that you get from society are benefits that you get from successful compatriots. That is to say, the more the other guy produces, the more he can trade with you. The more the other guy knows, the more you can learn from him. The wealthier he becomes, the more he can give you if he chooses. In all your relationships, at least if they're relationships of free exchange to mutual advantage, that is to say, trading relationships, the better the other person is doing, the better for you. So you need his rights respected so that he can flourish and produce, and, by trading with you, help you produce, survive, flourish, and be happy. And on that note, let's go to an exchange of questions and answers.